5 of the class. Um, Things are moving pretty quickly. This week we're covering the American Revolution, and I know that's a lot to fit into 1 week. Unfortunately, because this is a survey class, we have to cover quite a bit, so um, everything kind of gets compacted in. So you'll get the entire American Revolution this week. There's a lot to cover, but I think that it all comes together quite nicely here. Um, I posted the midterm assignment, so I'll take a minute to go over that with you here. As I posted last week, it's a 1,200 word essay, and I want you to specifically focus on this time period of early American history between 1590 and 1750. I really don't want you including details that come prior to 1590, like Columbus. I don't want anything after 1750, like the American Revolution, like we're focusing on this week. I specifically want this time period. And so here's the question that I'm asking for you to consider. The English colonies in North America experienced tremendous growth and success during the colonial period. Even so, major disagreements arose among the colonists and between the colonists and their governments. Describe major sources of disagreements in the New England and Chesapeake colonies. Your description should address causes and effects of these events. So essentially what I'm looking for, last week and the week before we talked about witchcraft, we talked about Hutchinson, we talked about Roger Williams, we talked about Bacon's Rebellion. The Pocahontas book has great details of the colonists sort of fighting with the Indians, but also fighting about how to treat the Native Americans. That's what I'm looking for you to do. So I'm looking for you to pick a total of 4 different conflicts that you've seen throughout this colonial period. And I sort of want you to discuss them and talk specifically about what caused them and what the effects of those conflicts were. And so one of the ways that I suggest starting this is to go back to John Winthrop's model of Christian charity and think about what John Winthrop's view was of this colony they were creating, and then what kind of goes out from there. If you remember, John Winthrop wants to establish a city on a hill, this place where they're all living together and they're establishing a colony, a society that the rest of the world can look to as an example of how God wants them to live their lives. And so then if you think about some of these problems that arise, how does that take the colonies farther away from Winthrop's fusion? And so I just mentioned this as something for you to start to think about, but I don't want that to be the focus of your paper. I really want the focus of your paper to be on these sources of disagreement. So you don't even have to consider Winthrop's model, but I just thought it was kind of a good place to start to think about what Winthrop wanted as like a cohesive society and what Winthrop gets as well as the Chesapeake. I want you to compare both Winthrop's New England as well as the Chesapeake. What they get is these instances of disagreement. So largely I'm asking you to pick out four areas of disagreement and describe them, talk about causes and effects of them. Should be 1,200 words in length. I would like you to have fewer than 5 direct quotations. And what that means is I don't want you to have more than 5 quotes from the course readings. That means with quotation marks. It's perfectly acceptable to paraphrase things from the course readings and to cite that they come from the course readings, but I would prefer that the majority of this paper be written in your words. So you're taking the information, putting it into your words, and still citing where it came from. I do like that you use parenthetical citations, so after every quotation, or even if you're using information that comes from somebody else, you need to cite the author's last name and where it came from. If you're going to cite information from the videos that I've had you look at, please just include the author's last name, and maybe if you have it, you don't need to spend a lot of time trying to track down what minute of the movie it came from, but that would be helpful for me. As always, I do like just to have your 800 number and not your name anywhere so that it can be completely anonymous as I'm grading your papers. The paper is due March 10th by just before midnight on Benko Hall. If it's submitted after that, 5 points will be deducted each day it's late, and I will not take any submissions after 48 hours. This is something to pay attention to. If your paper is more than 30% somebody else's words, I'm going to kick it back to you. And that's where the direct quotations come in line. So 30% of your paper can be direct quotations, or things taken from other people, but the rest of it really should be you expressing these ideas in your own words. So just make sure that I'm getting your voice here and not Eric Foner's voice over and over again. I want to hear your words about what's going on here and what the causes and effects are. As you're writing or after and before you start your writing, this would be good to take a look at. This is the rubric and how I grade it, and so you can kind of get a sense of where you stand based on what you ended up with. So I would definitely look at this as you're planning so that you have a good sense of what I'm looking for. Again, please contact me if you have any questions about this. I know it can be sort of daunting to have a writing assignment. So any questions, please email me. I'll try to get back to you as quickly as possible. We're reading chapter 5 in Foner this week, and I printed up some of the revolutionary documents. These are all extremely important primary sources. I'm just going to run through these a little bit so I can show you kind of what to focus on. The Proclamation of 1763 comes from King George III following the French and Indian War. We talked about this a little bit at the end of last chapter, and the effect that this has on preventing the colonists from moving westward. So most historians look to this as the beginning of the American Revolution and the effects of the end of the French and Indian War on the American colonists. And so this is one of the first things that begins to upset the colonists, the fact that their mobility has been limited, and then they're not being allowed to purchase Indian lands because of this document. So I really focus in on these underlined portions that I have underlined because that's really the majority of that. It's hard to read legal documents from the 1700s. I completely understand, and that's why I have underlined things. So I would really focus your attention on understanding these underlined portions. And I'll say, even if you just kind of want to focus in on those underlined portions, that's fine with me. I know these are difficult documents sometimes to get through. And so if you just kind of want to focus in on the underlined stuff, that's perfectly fine for this week. So the next two are pretty important documents, the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, and that gets the taxation of the colonies. And as you know, no taxation without representation is a huge theme throughout the American Revolution. Here, what I'm looking for is that you have a good reading of this opening paragraph, and that you also kind of get a sense of what the punishment is for people who do not abide by the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, and that usually comes in this last paragraph here. So first and last, paragraphs are the best ones to consider. For the Stamp Act, again, I'm looking for you to really sort of have a sense of this paragraph, and then also the last paragraph. But still, this one is not as difficult to read because it's largely just talking about all of the different types of paper that are going to have a stamp on them. And that becomes a pretty significant issue for colonists because this begins to touch every single colonist. The Sugar Act dealt largely with those who were importing sugar and molasses and rum and all those things that involve sugar. The Stamp Act begins to touch every colonist. If you graduated from college, your diploma had a stamp on it. You bought a newspaper, your newspaper had to have a stamp on it. You bought playing cards, your playing cards had to have a stamp on them. And so this one I would really sort of encourage you to try to get through as much of this one as possible because it's kind of interesting reading to see what was taxed and what was not taxed. The Boston Non-Importation Agreement is an agreement among a certain section of colonists that they would agree not to import any goods from the British colonies. So I want you to read this entire thing. It's a very quick read, and I think you'll get a lot out of that one. These two readings I'm going to ask you to read for the discussion for this week. This is the deposition of Captain Thomas Preston. Captain Thomas Preston was in charge of the British soldiers who fired on Boston citizens on the night of March 5th, 1770, the night of what's known as the Boston Massacre. So this is his take of what happened. And so I've edited this down a little bit so it's a little bit easier for you to read. But this gives you an overview of what Captain Preston says what happened. And then this is from the Boston Gazette and Country Journal. And this gives us sort of the colonist view. And you can see as you read these two accounts, things don't always match up. And that's what I'm looking for you to describe for me for this week's discussion. What doesn't match up? What does match up? And where would you fall? How would you sort of make this square in your mind? Who was at fault for the Boston Massacre? The Olive Branch Petition, I'm asking you to read this for one of your reflection questions. The Continental Congress, which is formed in the 1770s, 1774 to be exact, eventually writes this petition to the king. And if you're familiar with an olive branch, it symbolizes peace. And so they're looking for peace. Um, War has already broken out. Um, in April of 1775, we have the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And so there has now been bloodshed between the colonists and the Great British Army. And so this is the Continental Congress essentially asking the king for his help, that they would like his assistance with Parliament and for Parliament to stop taxing them unfairly. And so this can be surprising sometimes to see that they're using such strong positive language towards the king. And that's one thing that I would like you to remember this week. It's not until about the last moments that the colonists really start to turn on the king. For the majority of the lead up of the American Revolution, the colonists are mad at Parliament, and Parliament is the government, um, the lawmaking body of the government in Great Britain. So I really want you to keep that in mind. This shows us the affection they still have the king, and they still have for the king. And when they send him this petition, the king is not really responsive. And what the king sends back is a response in which he calls them rebellious and having caused sedition. So I'd like you to read these two documents to consider what the colonists are asking for and how the king responds. You can see the king responds pretty abruptly, essentially saying, you are an open rebellion and you need to fix that. I'll let you do the reading on your own. I'm not requiring you to read the Declaration of Independence, but I would strongly suggest you read the Declaration of Independence. It's very well written, written by Thomas Jefferson, edited by John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. We'll talk about that a little bit more next week. But it is basically a breakup letter. The now United States breaking up with England, and specifically what I like about the Declaration of Independence is now we're starting to see them blame the king. And what they do, what Thomas Jefferson largely did here, was list out specific things, he, telling us why they feel like the king has abused his power and why they feel like they need to now separate from England. And so this is very interesting because if you go back to the Olive Branch petition, they're saying these very nice things about the king. They're hoping that the king's going to help them solve their problem with Parliament. And now, in the Declaration of Independence, they're no longer blaming Parliament, they are blaming the king for all these issues. And so, essentially, this is them telling the world, and by them I mean the Continental Congress, telling the world why they are no longer going to be citizens of Great Britain. So the last one is Lord Dunmore's proclamation. And again, this one I basically offer you just for your own maybe enjoyment. Lord Dunmore offered this proclamation as a way to encourage slaves to run away from their masters in Virginia and to join the British Army. And if they joined the British Army, they would be given freedom. And this was something that worried George Washington, who was the commander-in-chief for the American armies. And in fact, one of his own slaves ran away and sought this protection with Lord Dunmore. And so you'll read about that in the Foner chapter this week about the effects of the Dunmore Proclamation. I have these 4 lectures from Joanne Freeman. Dr. Freeman is a professor at Yale in American history. She's an expert on Alexander Hamilton. She's an expert on the American Revolution. I think you're going to really like these lectures. She is very engaging. She's one of my favorite historians to follow. I think she makes history fun. So I would definitely recommend you watch all of her lectures. But for this week, these are the ones to focus on. The link for discussion 5 is for some reason not appearing there, so you'll just have to click down there for that one. And the reflection questions are here. Because there's a lot of reading to do this week, I did make the reflection questions a little bit easier, not as long. I wouldn't say they're easier, but they're just not as long. I'm hoping they'll open. So there's the discussion questions. Again, most of them looking for about 100 words this week. Next week, because there's not as much reading, we'll go back up to a little bit, 125, 150 words. And so then quiz 4 will open Wednesday. I've have a couple clips here that I often show in class when I meet with my classes face to face that I thought you might enjoy. The John Adams miniseries came out, I think, 2000. I want to say 2005 or 2006, and it's really good. Explores the life of John Adams, who goes on to become the second president of the United States, but and the first vice president of the United States. So there's these three pretty pivotal scenes of the American Revolution that take place in John Adams's world and his point of view. And the other one I did was from PBS, and it's an American Revolution documentary. And I wanted to open this so you could see essentially how this plays. There's 7 parts to it, and all the parts are over here. And I picked this one specifically because it gives a lot of military information. As you're going through this week, you're going to see that this largely focuses on political and social conditions of the revolution, and not as much as the military. You'll get a little bit of that in Dr. Freeman's lecture on George Washington and from the Foner reading. But if you're one of those people who really likes military history, because the American Revolution is very, very interesting military history, I would definitely suggest that. But again, these are just supplementary, and you're not required to watch those. I wanted to make a couple points just so you kind of have a sense of my view of the revolution and what I feel are important parts of the revolution. And I really like this image because this is residents of New Yorkers tearing down the statue of King George III. And so if we start back at 1763, at the end of the French and Indian War, the American colonists are so excited to be British. Even though they're 3,000 miles away from England, the fact that they are British and the British government is strong, the British Navy is strong, the British Army is strong, and they've just suffered, they just brought this tremendous defeat against France in the French and Indian War. American colonists are feeling extremely proud to be British. And so then our question is, what happens between 1763 and in 1776 when they're tearing down the statue of King George III and then melting down the statues to make bullets out of it? And so I wanted to start, I like this quotation from Samuel Adams. Samuel Adams is a resident of Massachusetts. He is a brewer. The beer, Samuel Adams, is named after him, but interestingly enough, that is not Samuel Adams on the beer bottle. They did not think that he was attractive enough to put on the beer named for him. But Samuel Adams has this quotation from 1764, right after the Sugar Act is passed by Parliament. And he says, "For if our trade may be taxed, why not our lands? Why not the produce of our lands and everything we possess or make use of? This we apprehend annihilates our charter right to govern and tax ourselves. It strikes our British privileges, which, as we have never forfeited them, we hold in common with our fellow subjects who are natives of Britain. If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having a legal representation where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves?" And so this largely is the argument that's made, no taxation without representation. Adams is saying that the American colonists have no representation in Parliament. As such, Parliament is passing laws which are taxing the colonists, and the colonists have no voice in Parliament. And so this is not the only cause of the American Revolution. Historians have been working hard for the past, let's say, maybe 60 to 70 years to really try and get a sense of what was the cause of the American Revolution. And certainly the taxes played a pivotal role. But as you go through this week, you're going to see some of the other reasons, whether it be political reasons or social reasons, economic reasons, that really were at the heart of the American Revolution. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, I kind of want you to focus on the Boston Massacre in your discussion. This is an engraving made by Paul Revere, silversmith out of Boston. Paul Revere gets credit for his ride alerting the colonists that the British were coming. That never happened. Paul Revere did make the ride, and he did alert people that the Bostonians, that the British were coming, but Paul Revere and his fellow Bostonians were British, so it really doesn't make a lot of sense that Paul Revere would go screaming through the countryside, "The British are coming." And Paul Revere was captured very early into his ride, and he left with 2 other people, and the people that actually accomplished the task don't really get the credit. Paul Revere gets all the credit. Paul Revere was a very famous silversmith in Boston, and he had this image created after the massacre. And I just want to draw your attention over here on the building behind the British firing into the crowd. It says Butcher's Hall. So kind of keep that in mind as you consider the Boston Massacre this week. Following the Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, Great Britain shuts down the port of Boston Harbor. And in response to that and some other acts that you'll read about, the Townshend Acts or the Intolerable Acts, the Continental Congress is formed. And this is really fascinating, and Dr. Freeman's going to talk about this. The colonies don't like each other. They have really no use for each other. One of my favorite stories comes from a book that describes that in early 1774, I believe, Massachusetts was under attack by Native Americans, and they asked New York for assistance, and New York said no, they could not provide any assistance. And the following year, New York came under attack by Native Americans, and they required and requested assistance from Massachusetts, and Massachusetts in return said, no, we cannot help you. The colonies really did not mesh together. They basically operated as independent countries. And the fact now that in 1774 they're coming together to form a Continental Congress, that's huge. So pay attention to that in that first lecture of Dr. Freeman's, because she does a really nice job of sort of laying out who likes who and who doesn't like who. And she has that quite funny moments of talking about how everyone hates Rhode Island, and Rhode Island sort of was this anomaly among the American colonies, that it seemed to be untrusted by most of them. As I mentioned a little bit earlier, these are some major dates. April 19th, 1775 is the first shots fired between the colonists and the British at Lexington and Concord. There's Ethan Allen, famous from Vermont and then eventually New York. And Connecticut troops led by Benedict Arnold, they take Fort Ticonderoga and get another early victory. And then there's a victory in March of 1776. And so one of the points I like to make is even though there is outbreak of war, even though the colonists are fighting the British, even in March of 1776, there's not a real push for independence. And I think a lot of times we kind of confuse that to think that as soon as the taxes came, Americans were saying independence, independence, but that's not true. And I think you'll see that with the Olive Branch petition, where the colonists are not asking for independence; they're asking for the king's assistance. They feel like they're not being treated fairly, and they just would like to finally be treated fairly. And that's really sort of sugarcoating it, and you'll see a little bit more of the in-depth nature of that as you go through this week. Common Sense was written by Thomas Paine. It's a pamphlet that begins to question the rule of a king in America. And Foner does a nice job of talking about this. So as you read chapter 5 of Foner, you'll kind of get a lot of the weight of common sense and the impact that common sense has on the revolution. Really like this image. This is the Declaration of Independence, a draft by Thomas Jefferson, and you can see changes made by John Adams and Benjamin Franklin, and this infuriated Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson really thought he had done a nice job, and Jefferson and Adams, they did what editors do. They edited it down. One of the things that they edited out was that Jefferson blamed King George III for the slave trade in America, which is really astounding to think about, that they would blame the king for the slave trade. And that's one thing that Jefferson wanted in, but Adams and Franklin nixed from the document. And when we talk about the Jefferson presidency, we'll talk about sort of how Jefferson's all over the place when it comes to slavery. He appears to be quite an anti-slavery person, but at the time he owns numerous slaves, and we'll talk about his relationship with his slaves when I get there too. I'll ask you to consider this week why Britain lost this war. When it went into it, everybody thought Britain was going to win this war easily. They had the strongest military and navy in the world. But to judge that out, Americans had fighting experience, and they had fighting experience in the British Army as part of the French Indian War. So that and Britain making some missteps were effective in helping secure American victory. if you're interested, I'll let you pause this and you can kind of read through it. This is a letter that George Washington writes to Henry Lee of Virginia, sort of giving his thoughts of what could possibly happen if Lord Dunmore's proclamation was allowed to go through. And we see the role of African Americans in this war. Washington initially did not want any African American troops in the Continental Army, but then allows them to serve, and they end up making up about 25% of the Continental Army. Next week, we'll consider changes for African Americans after the American Revolution, but it is important to note that they did fight in the Revolution. Unsurprisingly, they're coming largely from New England states. Most southern states do not want to send slaves away to fight in this war. Battle of Saratoga in October of 1777 is the turning point of the war. And it's the turning point of the war because the Americans have a tremendous victory. Really pay attention in Foner as he describes the Battle of Saratoga, because the way it comes together is just it's hilarious, one, to think about the missteps the British make, but it's also just the timing of it. The timing of it and how that's able to come together is truly tremendous. But it's called the turning point of the war because France agrees to join, wants to see the Americans can win some battles. And that's important because France pumps in a tremendous amount of money. They provide troops, they provide money, they provide support. There really could be no success for the Americans without the aid of France. And France also gets Spain to start to kick in money as well before Spain officially joins the war in 1779. So France getting into this war really does do tremendous things for the Americans. The war ends in 1781 at the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia. I would highly recommend a trip to Yorktown, Virginia. You can go right down to the water, and right next to the water, it's much of it is still sort of in the style that things were at the time of the American Revolution, and it's just a tremendous thing to see. So if you ever have some time, summer vacation, I would definitely recommend Yorktown, Virginia, because you can see where the war ends, and you can really start to feel like you're in that time period. This is the aftermath of the American Revolution. So Britain kept all of its territory in Canada, which is why Canada, the money of Canada, continues to have the monarch's face on it. The United States picks up this territory. So this now, which had all previously been British as a result of the end of the French and Indian War, this is now the United States. So the United States is everything east of the Mississippi River, with the exception of Florida. And we're going to see Florida eventually join the United States. And then this territory is French territory. There's some Spanish. This is not French territory, excuse me. This is Spanish territory, with Spain having a large section of this. It's eventually going to become French territory again. But right now, 1783, this is Spanish territory. This is a depiction of the end of the war with Yorktown, and Yorktown comes about largely with the aid of French ships blockading the English ships, and the English ships not being able to have any chance to get in to provide supplies to British troops who are waiting for them. And so just kind of wanted to give you some nice background on the American Revolution. I hope that was interesting to you. I think you're going to find this a very interesting week. There's a lot of good documents, a lot of good reading, a lot of good listening. So looking forward to hearing your responses, looking forward to seeing what you have to say for discussion. And again, as always, please email me if you have any questions.